Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am, as always, very happy to be with you for another episode of the podcast. Hope your week is going well so far. Hope you had a good weekend. The strange thing about continuing to mainly stay home is that my weekends feel like my weekdays, and so I'm always like, what did I do on my weekend? But I did actually get caught up on a few things this weekend, which made me very happy, and I was able to do some crocheting, which I am very behind on, and hopefully I can get some things done because Christmas is coming. So that was my weekend, getting caught up, hanging out with the hubby, doing some crochet, all good stuff. I have, of course, an author interview for you today, and this one is really good timing because this week is Veterans Day, and this is a historical fiction book set in World War II. The author is Samuel Marquis, and the book is called Soldiers of Freedom. Soldiers of Freedom is the true story of the 1944-45 war in occupied Europe and the final Allied struggle to conquer Nazi Germany. The story is told through the eyes of William McBurney, a tank gunner in the 761st Tank Battalion, the first African-American tank unit in World War II. Dynamic General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, and Angela Lang, a 16-year-old German resistance fighter with the anti-Nazi Edelweiss Pirates in Cologne. While Patton's forces liberate France and Belgium, fight in the grueling Battle of the Bulge, and cross the Rhine to conquer Germany, U.S. tanker William McBurney and his Black Panthers must fight two wars at once, one against the German army, the other against the racism of their fellow white soldiers. Meanwhile, as the Allies drive into Germany, Edelweiss pirate Angela Lang must survive the Allied bombing of Cologne while she engages in fierce resistance against the Hitler Youth and Nazis and is hunted down by the Gestapo. The real-life heroism of the 761st Black Panthers and legendary Patton to liberate Europe and the Edelweiss Pirates to combat Nazism comes to life in this historically accurate tale of the final epic struggle in World War II Europe. So that is the description of Soldiers of Freedom. And, as I said, it's very appropriate since Veterans Day is this week, and we will be celebrating those who have served, past and present. And first of all, the level of research that went into this book is amazing, and it is so detailed and so rich with the story. But also, it's historical fiction, but it's based on real people. So William McBurney, real person. I believe Sam says that he is no longer living, but he was a real person. He fought in this first African-American tank battalion. Angela, the Edelweiss pirate character, is actually a composite of some characters, and Sam will explain more about that as we go through it. But everything is really based in historical fact, and so it's historical fiction simply because, there are some things that you have to fill in that you can't always know when it comes to historical fiction, but it is really well researched, and it is, it's fascinating because I did not know about either of these groups, and I feel fairly well versed in World War II history. If you're a regular listener, that I love books set in this time period, but it's such a broad time frame, and the scope of World War II is just huge because it took place across the world, and there are so many different stories and different settings that you can talk about. So I was really interested to learn about Patton's Panthers and the Edelweiss Pirates. I didn't even have an inkling of, and I talked to my parents, and they said, nope, we've never heard of it either. Actually, everyone that I've spoken to, some of them have heard of Patton's Panthers, but no one so far that I've spoken with about this book has heard of the Edelweiss Pirates. So really cool to learn about something else that I didn't know about in terms of World War II history. So I can say thank you to Samuel Marquis for bringing these things to my attention so I could learn something new. Let's go ahead and turn to the interview now and learn more about Soldiers of Freedom from the author himself, Samuel Marquis. Samuel, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah.
I am very excited to have you here. We are here to talk about your latest historical fiction book. It's called Soldiers of Freedom. Before we get to the book and the series, though, if you could share a bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Okay. Yes, I'm a practicing hydrogeologist, and I work as an expert witness in the environmental industry, testifying in groundwater cases, and also working in environmental consulting to kind of clean up hazardous waste sites. And I also obviously write historical fiction novels. I've written 11 of them, and several of them have received awards for either in historical fiction or in the history kind of categories. And so really I kind of wear two hats, but really writing's my true passion, and it's specifically in historical fiction, colonial America, World War II, the American West, and all of those areas are what I'm really passionate about. And
speaking of World War II, that's the time period that this book is set in, and it's actually part of a series. You've written multiple books about World War II. Can you give they're standalone books, but can you talk about the series sort of as a whole?
Yeah, my dad and my father's, my wife's father both served in World War II, and so I grew up, hearing World War II stories and watching a lot of World War II movies. So it was always something that always interested me. So I've written 5 books in my World War II series. They are all standalone, and they're not specifically chronologic, but they could be read in chronologic order, if you want sort of the flavor of the war. And so I try now. I initially started out kind of doing historical fiction with a lot of historical figures, but also some fictionalized characters. And then as I evolved, I kind of was like, well, I really want to just tell the true story. And I really try and stick to the, to the, the actual events that happened. So my first book was more historical fiction, revolving around a kind of fictionalized idea of a countdown to D-Day and, the Enigma Code. And then the last 3 really have been pretty much pure history books, really. Yes, you have to supply some dialogue and some, in the few scenes that I have where, it might be just an introspective, character going through his thoughts and things like that. But really 90% of it is just pure history, and I try and take the actual historical figures and not use fictionalized characters unless I absolutely have to.
The current book is called Soldiers of Freedom, and it's a true story about 2 groups that people may or may not be very familiar with. So there's Patton's Panthers, as well as the Edelweiss Pirates, which is the best name ever. So let's start with the Panthers. Can you talk about that group and why you decided to feature it in this book?
Yeah, so my latest book, Soldiers of Freedom, is the 5th in my World War II series. And it really, I initially wanted to do Patton's Panthers, who are the 761st Tank Division, which is the first African-American tank division in United States history that fought in battle. There had never been a black tank unit before, and to be quite honest, the American military and government, tried to do everything to not have this unit, except for just they'd be training, and it was basically Eleanor Roosevelt who pushed it hard. And without her, it would have never even happened. But she was insistent that black Americans get to serve in the military in fighting roles and not just being in supply and cooks and stevedores and all the other offloaders and things like that, truckers. And so she really pushed for it. The military was reluctant, but Leslie McNair, a general, white guy, did the right thing, which you always find these in the history of these revolutions where we're trying to get equality. There's a lot of good white guys behind it too, which is important to know. Patton, for instance, and McNair, eventually pushed for to have black tankers in the U.S. Armed Forces. So I wanted to write that book, and I had that in my head, and then I wanted to have the on-the-ground resistance fighter, but I wasn't sure if it would take place in eastern France, the northeast corner of France, somewhere in there, or Belgium or Germany. And so I was kind of trying to, how can I have them? Because the problem is Patton's forces moved so fast, and the Panthers didn't come into the picture until November, so well after the Normandy invasion. So I was grappling with, I wanted to have some resistance fighter on the ground. So I was kind of going with the French resistance initially. And then they just didn't, the troops were just moving too fast, and there was just not enough resistance at that point, became kind of secondary for the French. So kind of after D-Day, there wasn't nearly as much activity by the French resistance because the Allied troops just moved across France so fast. And so then I stumbled upon the Edelweiss Pirates. It's just like, I don't know, I just came across them by Google searching, and I was like, God, these guys are cool. And they, German resistance? Who are these youth rebelling against Hitler? What an incredible concept that is. No one's ever heard of them. I'd never heard of them. And so then I just meshed that into the story, and so that I could build around. And I realized the parallels between black persecution during World War II of the troops, against their own white troops, not just against the German enemy. And then the Edelweiss Pirates, who were fighting their own oppression from, the Nazis, who were persecuting them for, just kind of they were basically kind of anti-war and also just rebellious against Nazism, So once I fit that in, I just blended it in as best I could to tell the story, kind of two independent stories that then coalesce.
And I am one of the people that had not heard of the Edelweiss Pirates. I'm also fascinated by World War II history and have read a lot about the period. I was actually a history major in college, but had not heard of this group. So I was really intrigued. I mentioned it to my parents the other day, and they hadn't heard it. So I'm probably going to be passing on the book to them so they can read it as well. But let's talk about the two characters from these groups. So we'll start with William. He is the young black man in the book. He's a real person. So can you talk a little bit about William?
Yeah. So William McBurney was, in his late teen when he signed up. He was actually, had just turned 18. He wanted to sign up before, but his dad wouldn't let him. Dad had fought in World War I. And so I took this character, William McBurney, who was in other books. Some of the books that, greatly affected my story were Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's book on the Black 761st Tank Battalion. And he had a fair amount on McBurney in there because his father, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's original name was Lou Alcindor. And his father, Alcindor, was in the Army, and he was good friends with Leonard Smith, who was the best friend of William McBurney, very close friend during World War II, and they ended up, saving each other and getting each other through the war. Well, this guy, Schmitty's father was best friends with Alcindor, who was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's father, who served in the war. So I had a fair amount on McBurney from that book, and then some of the other books I got, I had enough on him to make him the lead character and sort of the voice of the 761st Tank Division and a battalion, excuse me. And so, I just built a story around him, and so that to personalize it. And also, he was an interesting. He's a kid. I think he's either just passed away or getting up there in years, but he may still be alive, which is amazing because he showed up at all the events for years, and so it's just an interesting. He was just an interesting story to build it around.
Yeah, he sounds fascinating, and the connection, the fact that you learned about him from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's book, that is, I just think that's really cool. The connections in there. So, what about William do you think is going to resonate with readers?
I think he's just like my dad was at the war. He's almost the same. He was born, around the same time, and he's just a kid. I mean, he's a kid who lived in Hell's Kitchen, New York. Back in so you're talking about right after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and he's just a guy just like all the guys who wanted to go fight for his country, and he didn't. He wanted to be a pilot though. He read a thing in the New York Post or the New York Times about opportunities for black guys in the air in the Air Corps. It's called the Air Corps then, and so he went into the recruiting station in Lower Manhattan to sign up for that, and he was told, it's my first scene in my book, so I played it out almost exactly, but everything that we know was said, and he was told, no, you can't do that, and why not? Well, and he kept saying, he wouldn't say because you're black. He's just like, well, we can't do that, son, and that's how it was. And so, but the guy at least was nice, helpful enough to say, well, with this tank corps, there's this new tank group coming up. You could try that. So he signed up for that, and he got into the tank corps because he first of all, he was already pre-screened because he had to take the aptitude test. And all these black tankers were exceptionally smart guys that had to make it through to score high. You had to score a certain get a certain point percentage in that test to even get to be a tanker. Otherwise you'd be a foot soldier, an infantryman, and not have any choice, or be thrown in the Navy. And so he, like my dad was. And so he got into the tank group because he was smart, and he was, proved to be a very talented gunner. So he came in as a tank gunner operating a 75 millimeter, 76 millimeter cannon on the tank, on the Sherman tanks. I mean, they didn't train on Sherman tanks. They didn't have, kind of crummy tanks to begin with. But eventually, he was fighting in Shermans when he was in northeastern France, Belgium, and in Germany. So he was a kid, a New York kid growing up, and just an average guy. He played some football. Got to know Jackie Robinson in my book, who's a character, and so I think he's just, what's great about him is he's just a real, just average guy who became a hero and probably just wanted to do his job. He wanted to serve his country, and that's it. It was as simple as that. He just wanted to get that chance.
Right. Yep. Have you spoken with his family, or what sorts of research did you do into his role in the book?
I didn't reach out to, because it's right. I'm writing historical fiction, even though I'm trying to write as accurately as possible. So I didn't reach out to, I checked out their website, the 761st Tank Battalion website that was headed up by Joe Wilson, who wrote a great book on the 761st Tank Division, or Battalion, excuse me, I keep saying that. But it had ended in kind of the, around 2011, I think. So there weren't enough guys alive still, unfortunately, in the battalion, and so the website had kind of been discontinued. But Joe Wilson was nice enough to recommend me to a French World War II author recently, who emailed me because he wants to get his book published in the U.S., and I, sent him some information as much as I could to help him. So Joe Wilson, whose father was in the 761st Tank Battalion and has done a lot to help and publicize and bring attention to the battalion, Patton's Panthers, with his book and also on the website, because he was kind of the administrator of the website, did recommend me to. So there's people out there who are getting the book, but it's probably the sons of the battalion, because there's just not many of them left, unfortunately.
Well, it is a fascinating story, and not one that gets highlighted very often, as is the other part of the story with the Edelweiss Pirates. Now, Angela is the character that is part of the Edelweiss Pirates, and she is more of a composite of real people. Is that correct?
Yes. Unfortunately I wanted to base the character originally on Mucky Koch, who was a real Edelweiss pirate woman. Unfortunately, she was imprisoned and tortured and had to move around so much, I couldn't keep it in one centralized place. So I did make that character is fictionalized in a composite of really several characters. So she's kind of based on Bartholomew Schenk, who has a street named after him and a plaque. Who in the book I also made her boyfriend is kind of based on Bartholomew Schenk too. So I kind of made those two together, kind of telling the story of the Edelweiss Pirates. So she's based on loosely Mucky Koch, and but also with some of the events that Barthol Schenk went through. And Jean Julich, who also was, in the mix, who actually I made him the real character, but some of the incidents kind of that Mucky goes through is really kind of, sort of hybridized of based on three characters. So the events are real, the character is fictionalized, but based loosely on one primary female character.
We're going to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. I hope that you are enjoying learning all of this all these interesting facts about World War II, or maybe you already knew some of them, but now you're learning more. I don't know. When we come back, we'll be talking more about the Edelweiss Pirates, so stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with Samuel Marquis about his historical fiction book, the fifth in the series. It's called Soldiers of Freedom. And can you talk a little bit about the Edelweiss Pirates and Angela's role within them? Because you speak a little bit in the afterword of the book about how it's not a well-known group, and also what was known about them, that it was kind of underplayed or dismissed a little bit, but they have been recently acknowledged as an actual resistance group. So can you talk a little bit about the Edelweiss Pirates?
Yeah, what happened to the Edelweiss Pirates is initially they were initially kind of started out as just rebellious youth who were most of them were anti-Nazi, but some of them weren't even 100% anti-Nazi. They just wanted to not be put in work groups at the front and not be sort of dictated to with this educational program that was so heavily Nazified, where everything was subverted to the state. So some of them just wanted, they just wanted to be kids, teenagers growing up and independent. So it started out, they take guitars and go in the countryside around Cologne and some of the other cities, Dusseldorf and Hamburg and all these other cities, really the Western, more progressive part of Germany. And so they would go in the woods and kind of camp out and sing songs, and they'd sing kind of anti-Nazi songs. And they'd go there on the weekends originally, and they did this in the mid-30s it began. Well, that continued, and then the Nazis didn't even want them doing that. So they would round them up, shave their heads, put them in jail for a day or two to scare them. Back then they were just sort of regarded as just sort of rebellious kids. And Himmler and his SS, they were on the radar, but they weren't brutal to them, but they'd abused them. And then they were fighting the Hitler Youth too then. So the kids were, these Edelweiss Pirates originally, the Cologne Navajos, there were different groups. And they had other names. The Edelweiss Pirates is just the umbrella of all the different groups, name for all the different groups. And so they would sort of rebel against the Hitler Youth, and they would actually fight them on the streets sometimes. As the war began and escalated, and the Allies approached closer and closer, especially once they got a toehold in Normandy, they ramped up their rebellion, and then they started bombing and stealing at a higher rate, stealing weapons, fighting in the streets, actually fighting with the Gestapo sometimes, and doing a lot more, derailing trains. They did more and more, became more and more a resistance group and not just sort of a teen rebellion group. When the war ended, they weren't necessarily all pro-American. They kind of viewed them as sort of, or pro-British especially, as being a little bit imperial and going to come in and treat Germany badly, And so they didn't just jump on the bandwagon. They offered their services to the Allies in rooting out the Nazis, but that was denied. They didn't. The Allies wanted to think that every German was evil. They wanted all the Germans to be lumped under sort of not the Nazi banner, and they sort of had difficulty understanding, that there was German resistance, and the British in particular didn't really want to give credit to it. So that's why Valkyrie and those plots, even if they had taken out Hitler, probably might not have amounted to much, because Himmler would have just taken over and Goering. So really there was a lot of denial on the part of the Allies for giving credit to these resistance fighters, because now today they're viewed as resistance fighters, or at least resistance group. For what they did, and they've been honored, and it took a long time, just like the Patton's Panthers, the 761st Tank Battalion. They weren't recognized until the Carter administration.
The two groups, as I mentioned before, Patton's Panthers and the Edelweiss Pirates, are possibly even probably not well known to a lot of people, especially the Edelweiss Pirates. And so I was actually excited to learn something new. It's one of my fascinations with this time period is that the war was so vast in scope, and there are so many different stories from all over the world. Is that something that is important to you when you sit down to write a historical fiction, that you highlight something that maybe is not well known, or does that just tend to come out in the writing process?
That's a good question. I've kind of gone a little bit both ways. My thing is to try and get the history as accurate as I can. And so, and still make it as much of a page turner as I can. I still try and make it, I write it like a suspense novel, but I try and make it all the history's accurate. The dialogue is always built around known dialogue of people, unless it's kind of the event of two lovers together alone, and then that's kind of the made up kind of stuff that, that lovers would normally have, or husband and wife or whatever, or two two gay lovers or whatever it would be in the book. And so I try and stick to history as accurately as I can. But then what I do is I pick what I think are the most dynamic events in that person's life. And I also make everything character driven. So all of my books are 3 to 6 point of view characters, a balance of male and female, different ages. So in this one, you get Patton, you get the, General Patton. And for him, almost everything is just historically documented. McBurney, most stuff is, virtually. And then Angela, I'd take a little more liberties, but I make all the historical events are accurate and as accurately depicted as I can. And the people that were there were the right people, all the right people. And Angela is more of a composite character, though. And so really the key is I try and pick things maybe that history's overlooked, but also people that have been overlooked in history. So Spies the Midnight Sun is really about Eddie Chapman, who's was a safecracker who became a world-class spy and is the model for James Bond. Not everybody knows about Eddie Chapman. I picked that guy out, and then 2 Norwegian resistance fighter women who have been totally overlooked by history and were considered to be, they were ostracized for supporting the Germans when they were actually fighting against them, and they were spies. But, when you're a spy, sometimes not everybody knows it. And so they were betrayed by their countrymen, they're Norwegians, and they were resistance, women who were, exceptional. So I told that story because those people were unheralded. They should have been remembered for what they did, and they weren't. Then my next book, Lions of the Desert, which is the 4th in the series, is a straight ahead, basically the story of Operation Condor in the North African desert, and it's it's basically the true story of The English Patient, the movie and the book, because that author actually didn't tell the true story. It's actually, he made it pretty much a fictionalized account that's based very loosely on the actual events. I took The English Patient, and told the real story in my book, Lions of the Desert. So that's the 4th in the series. So that one, I was kind of like, I wanted to make sure they hit, correct. First of all, I thought it was a great spy story and romantic and North African desert and, British agents and German agents and Rommel. And so that, I wanted to tell that story, but I wanted to make it accurate, because The English Patient, it just wasn't the real story. But I love The English Patient. I love the movie, but it's just not real. And so then my last book, I wanted to just tell the real story of Patton, McBurney, and the Edelweiss Pirates, through Angela, Marquis Koch, but unfortunately she was in prison so much, like I said before, and had to kind of hide out on a farm for like several months. And so I kind of couldn't have her where I needed her to be. So that's why I had to, unfortunately, use a fictional character there, even though I didn't want to.
Will there be a 6th book in the series?
Yes, I think right now I'm writing I'm the 9th great grandson of Captain Kidd, William Kidd, the privateer. And so I'm writing a book now because I really want to get that story out there. So I'm taking a little break from World War II since I've written kind of 5 books in the series now, and writing this book on my ancestor, Captain Kidd. But I will do a 6th book. And to be honest, I had actually started it when I switched ideas and decided to do Captain Kidd. And so I kind of have the 6th book and even the 7th book in the series in my head already, because I think them out long before I start them. And I start reading up. So I usually gear up a couple years before on ideas that I like, and then I just feel like I have to make sure the characters I can not fictionalize them as much as so there's enough known about them. I need a certain amount of information to be able to tell the story.
And you mentioned the book about William Kidd. Is this something that you've known all your life? Is it passed down in the family, or is it something you found out through like ancestry or something like that? How has that story come into fruition?
Oh, no, I've grown up. I've always been grown up knowing I was the 9th great grandson of Captain Kidd. We've been talking about him since I was a little kid. And then we, there is the genealogy backs it up in terms of And we luckily at our family has, some top researchers, Professor David Boyles of the South Dakota School of Mines, and sort of he's a genealogist, so he sort of tracked all that. And then we've had other people in the family that have someone wrote a 780-page thing outlining all the ancestral things. So it's been well established since I was a little kid. The thing is, I grew up on stories that were totally untrue though, because everything I learned, he was a pirate, he was the most vicious pirate of all time, and obviously it's a lot more complicated than that. Privateers, were and pirates were an integral part of the growth of colonial America. It was basically people think of pirates as these rogues who were social isolates and didn't have families and stuff. That's totally false. They were like guys who wanted to go out and strike it rich, young guys, or older guys who were just seamen who had families. And smuggling and piracy were part of the very fabric of colonial America. As a matter of fact, we wouldn't have had it made. They wouldn't have survived economically without it. In New York was prominent. In Boston, the Puritans were, they looked the other way for smuggling and piracy too. Of course, they'd lock up pirates when they had to and were sort of forced, but they looked away on a lot of stuff. Charleston, you look at, Rhode Island was the biggest pirate stronghold in colonial America. So it was really part of the growth of America, which is interesting. See, that's why I like to learn and tell the real history, because the history you learn in school is a lot of times largely wrong, or at least tells only half the story.
Absolutely, yeah. So are you working on just a standalone novel? Will this be a series? How are you envisioning telling his story?
Well, I have enough material that I would envision I might do a series of books on privateers and pirates in colonial America. So I haven't given a thought. I'm going to do this book now, this book that I'm doing now, and I'm going to do it as narrative nonfiction too, because it's just I want to just tell the story accurately. But I'm also writing the historical fiction version too, which is I'm kind of doing that first, and then I'm going to tell a narrative nonfiction. And I don't know which one I'm going to go with. I'm going to have to make a decision, but I wanted to get the accurate story, but I also wanted I'd already started it in my style of historical fiction. So I'm going to get that done first and then do the narrative nonfiction version. But it will be the first pirate book, quote unquote pirate book, written that I know of by the direct descendant of the pirate, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Because I haven't seen one yet.
Interesting.
So I'm looking forward to it, and I'm kind of consumed with it right now. Like, I'm getting all the primary references, and with COVID, I'm taking some work to get some things from Q in London. So, but I have almost 90% of it, and it's going well. It's just a great story.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. Let's go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. As we go to that break, I will say that my mom has done a ton of work on our family's history and genealogy and ancestry and all of that good stuff. And there is no one famous in my family tree. Lots of interesting people, but no one famous. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. Do you have anyone famous in your family tree? I'd love to hear about it. You are listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, Sam was talking about the new book or books that he is working on based on his ancestor, William Kidd. And so now let's go ahead and talk about the amount of research that has to go into these books that he writes.
For this book and your other books, I imagine there's a lot of research that goes into that. How much research do you generally do before you start writing?
I usually read, sometimes it's like years in the making. Like Blackbeard, my agent wanted me to do it a long time ago. And then I kept like, well, we're doing these other things, just kind of went ahead of it. And then, so I'd thought about that for years before I wrote Blackbeard. So I've already written one pirate book. And what I wanted to do is I take the newest research and all the historical documents. I get my hands on everything I can get, my World War II books, I'm getting the CIA files and the British Secret Service files, MI5 files, detailed. And, and I get some, the ones in Norwegian and German that have been translated. And so I get as much primary material as I can get my hands on. I've had to deal a little more with Captain Kidd just because I'm doing a narrative, I'm doing a nonfiction book now. So it has to be as good as any, nonfiction book that's ever been written on my ancestor. The difference is that it'll be written by an ancestor of Captain Kidd, and I'm telling his story. So, I'm sympathetic, but I'm tough on him too. It's when it's your ancestor, all of a sudden you're like, the events strike you, harder. You're definitely, the emotion level's up. But at the same time, you hold them to a high standard because they kind of, you're a descendant of them. So you don't want them to, you kind of like, God, why'd you do that? And part of it's just our time is so vastly different. People were, dramatically different then, and you can't hold them to the standards of today. That's wrong. That's the wrong way to do history. So you can hold them only to the standards that existed in their time, So, with some exceptions. So it is an exciting thing to take history and try and do it accurately. And I try and be as accurate as I can, but it's still kind of my interpretation of history to some extent. But I try and be as fair and balanced, and most of my readers acknowledge that. Mm-hmm. They like the historical accuracy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good way for people to learn something that they may not know, or learn more about a topic that they are interested in. But with the underlying story, especially with historical fiction, with that underlying story, it can be a little easier to learn rather than reading just a straight textbook or a history book.
Yeah, but I'm going to write Captain Kidd as narrative nonfiction. So believe me, it's going to read my historical novels. A lot of people, to be honest, I won in a history category. I won in a historical nonfiction category for one of them. It was entered in that by my publicist, and it won. So that's how accurately I'm trying to stick to history in my historical fiction. But I'm going to take it up a little notch, have proper footnoting in this book on Captain Kidd, because I want it to be, as good as any book that's ever been written on him, but with the latest, the last 20 years of research, and it's written by, the ninth great grandson of Captain Kidd. That's kind of the, something that I can bring to the table.
Mm-hmm. In terms of writing, is it something that you always wanted to do growing up, or did you come to it later in life? How did that work for you?
No, I always wanted to. I always loved writing, and I just, I probably when I was young, I was kind of a sort of wild, athletic boy. Probably had too much energy, and so I probably wanted to be a writer more than I was good at it, until I just remember being read aloud in like 6th grade by the teacher in front of the whole class for the first, and I wrote this thing, and I had I still remember it. it began like on a Father's kind of day with leaves and your father's out there raking the leaves and I'm jumping in them. And it was and I was like, the teacher read it and everyone went, oh, and I was like, God, I might be good at this. It was the first time. The teachers can have, you forget these little events in your life that could be life transforming. And that was one for me. And so I wrote my first novel in high school. It was terrible. I wrote it out on this is, showing my age a little bit, but those big 11 by 17 yellow pads, back then, not everything was typed up, so, and it was terrible. But I wrote my first kind of novel in high school. And I just, I took a lot of English classes, even though I was a geology major in college. So I always wanted to write. I was always kind of like, well, you got to make a living, son. And then, but I really wanted to be a writer. And then, finally I just started doing it, kind of had two careers, so it was always in there. It was from an early age, and, I always wanted, and I always took a lot of English classes, but I wasn't actually a journalism or a, writing major or English major, in college.
Mm-hmm.
But I published a lot of papers too. I guess I should say that I published maybe 25 peer-reviewed papers in journals, and now I've published 11 books. That takes a fair amount of, drive to do that many books and that many peer-reviewed papers in scientific journals and publish a master's thesis. I published my master's thesis in the American Association of Petroleum Geologists back in the day when really only PhDs were kind of publishing it. So obviously I wanted to be the writing, whether it was technical writing or, more fiction writing. I always liked writing and the process of creating.
Yeah, thank you for that. Out of your own experience then, would you have advice for aspiring authors?
Do I have a site for them, or I actually, can you run me by that again?
Yeah. Do you have advice for aspiring authors, especially people who are looking to write historical fiction?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think I've written. As a matter of fact, I forgot to say too, I've written a large number of articles since I've been writing the last decade or so, and so I've published a lot of articles on historical fiction writing. So if you Google my name, some of them will come up. But the one thing I'd say, I think, and not everybody would agree with this, but I think it's really important to stick to the history and just take the most important events, most life-changing events or dramatic, and then highlight those. So I try and recreate every scene I can and make it pure history. Of course, there's some added dialogue. Of course, you're thinking their thoughts. Of course, you're thinking, there's some liberties in there. But I'm almost always true to the exact dialogue. And I take it from their journals. Like, Patton had kept a journal throughout the war. And so you have every day of his thoughts and what he thinks and stuff. So, I try and take as much of those. And Rommel kind of did the same thing. So some of the major people of history, I get a lot from their journals or even articles. McBurney, I got a fair amount after the war because he's been in the news and you can hear what he had to say. So I take what he might have said in, 2002, but it's relevant to something he talks about in the past. And I take his words there and put them in the book where I think they, would belong. I'm still taking his words, but I'm taking them, a little bit later after his life because I don't have as much. He didn't leave a journal, So I think what I would say for aspiring, historical fiction authors is just go try and pick a event that you find important and characters that you can stand behind. Because I love my characters, my villains even too. I pick guys who are, even my villains, I pick guys who are gray, who show some gray. Even some of the, some of the guys who are in the SS, I pick guys who are deliberately gray and are sort of intriguing and even go to the other side a little bit. They go both ways. They're not pure Nazis. You'd be surprised at the gray areas, even for, some German guys during World War II. And so I think the key is historical accuracy. Pick characters that you really can stand behind, that have enough history that you can not take endless liberties. Either that, or some people write historical fiction that's not really history. It's just, it takes place during historical events, but it's completely fictionalized people. And I'd say, the way that he wrote The Incas Patience, that's not, it's really fiction. There's almost very little of the history did he actually stick to. So it's almost really, can't really almost call that historical fiction, I'd say. So I think you want to take it a notch and be a little more historically accurate, because then you can say, hey, it's as accurate as I can make it, and then except for the dialogue and some of the intimate scenes behind, where someone's being consoled or they're with their lover, you have to take a few liberties there and sort of recreate their character, but it has to be consistent with their character. And I would say the most important thing to avoid is, don't take a historical character and force them to some modern day thing to make him or her look better. Don't take away their flaws of their era. If they were, whatever, if they were maybe slaveholders, back in colonial times, for instance, everyone did it then. I'm not talking about during the Civil War and leading up to Civil War. By then, once Britain and France had discontinued the practice, that was a different story. That's when it becomes much more like taboo and downright evil. And it's downright evil to begin with, let's face it. But it's a lot different in 1650 than it is in 1830. Big difference. It's also a big difference on the southern plantation versus up north, with a maid versus a field hand. And I'm not trying to say it's not evil, because it's evil to begin with. But there's shades of gray in certain historical things that people did. I understand, women were treated obviously not nearly as good. So back in the colonial times or less. So, for instance, Captain Kidd and his wife were incredibly close. He actually did a lot of things to avoid to make sure that she was prominent, and she went out of her way to help rescue him in his time of trouble. So here's one of the greatest love stories ever written. Captain Kidd and Sarah Kidd, my ninth great-grandfather, and his wife, and they are, remarkable people. And they were fighting, kind of against British oppression, and he was a hero for America. He's fighting the French on behalf of colonial America, and he actually did, like his wife wanted him to stay at home more, and he did. Some of the things he did are very modern, but you have to be careful in, I think, historical fiction in trying to make it, to modernize your characters too much, because they were different then. We have to accept some of the flawed things they did then as part of their fabric of their culture, and not make it fit our modern idea. At the same time, I always try and pick people that were kind of progressive in their era, because that's the people I'm drawn to naturally. So, if that's what you need to do, then pick someone who's, like Harriet Tubman. I mean, she's a hero in any world, right? I mean, here's this incredible woman, black woman, who's freeing, hundreds of slaves and bringing them as almost a scout or a guide across the border through swamps, crossing rivers, going through trees, being hunted down by hounds. And, I mean, she's a hero. I mean, an outrageous hero in her era. So, if those are the people you're drawn to, then, pick those kinds of people, to your books. But don't try and modernize them artificially.
Okay, time for the last break of the podcast, and when we come back, we'll be wrapping up the interview with Sam. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Samuel Marquis.
I would imagine that you do a lot of reading when, in terms of research, but when you take time to read just for yourself, what are your favorite authors or genres?
Unfortunately, I don't have any reading time to myself at all because I have to read so much to write these books. I mean, I have literally read probably 100 books on Captain Kidd and maybe 500 articles in the last 6 months. So I have zero time for anything else. But what I like, the people that I like Ben McIntyre, who writes World War II and espionage stories. He's British. I love Ron Chernow, who's written on Grant and Washington and Alexander Hamilton. And I read a lot of historical nonfiction is what I read. And so those are two of the guys. I'm trying to think of who else. Looking on my bookshelf here because I can't remember. Oh, I like Colin Woodard. I like Rick Atkinson, who's written great World War II thing. Actually, he was influential in me starting to write these World War II books. Rick Atkinson, he wrote that World War II trilogy, and now he's writing a Revolutionary War trilogy. And so I like him a lot. So those are some of the people. I'm trying to think of some others, and I can't think. I've read Stephen Ambrose. I like some of his World War II stuff. Trying to think of who else there is. Oh, Philbrick, Nathaniel Philbrick. Eric Larson. So I like Eric Larson. So those are all nonfiction books. So those are the ones that I do read. I guess I read a tiny bit outside of when I'm doing research. But lately, for the last few years, it's been pretty heavy on the research because I have to read so much to write a historical fiction novel. It's an astronomical amount that you have to kind of take in to really be accurate.
Right, sure. Well, thank you for that. I know you have a website, so if you could tell people where to find your website as well as where they might be able to interact with you on social media.
Yeah, so my website is just samuelmarquisbooks.com, basically. And if you Google me, you'll get a fair amount of stuff because I've written a fair amount of articles and had reviews and stuff. So my social media, it's just Samuel Marquis Books. So I think really if you just go to Samuel Marquis Books, it has all the links. SamuelMarquisBooks.com, it'll have kind of my backstory, descriptions of all my books, and it'll have buying links to, indie bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and all the buying options and stuff. And also links to all my social media, too. So I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I guess I'm on LinkedIn, but I think that's a little more my just geologist profile. So that's kind of where I am. And if you just Google me, if you just Google Samuel Marquis Books, you'll get more information than you need.
Okay, sounds good. Well, we have talked about quite a few different topics today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to mention or bring up?
No, I guess we kind of talked about Captain Kidd, my newest book, early on. So we kind of covered that. So normally I would have kind of segued to my newest book, but I've already done that. But I guess what I want to leave people with is, who, especially people who maybe haven't read my books, what I strive for, and I think I've come out, and I've kind of said it in this interview, is I really do strive for historical accuracy, is, first and foremost, and at the same time try and make a very suspense-driven novel with characters that people will care about, but also tell an interesting story from a historical standpoint. But I do really try and stick to accuracy. So I think for some people who like to only read historical nonfiction, I think they may be surprised if they read my books that basically you'll find it very similar to the narrative nonfiction of an Eric Larson or a Nathaniel Philbrick, or some of these others who are writing, they're writing nonfiction, but they're writing narrative nonfiction, which comes very close to historical fiction, at least my historical fiction. So I would just, say that to people that, if you want historical accuracy and sort of, either little known events or people who are overlooked by history, that's kind of what my books try and bring out. All of them, whether it's Blackbeard, Captain Kidd, or, my World War II books in the desert that kind of feature Rommel, or my new book that features Patton. We haven't talked about Patton at all, but, the new book is not just McBurney and the Edelweiss Pirates, but George Patton, who I guess one thing I'd like to leave people with was instrumental in supporting the Black Panthers. The 761st Tank Division is called Patton's Panthers for a reason, because he asked specifically for them, and he's the first, white combat, general to integrate to get black, tankers in the Third Army, and they were instrumental. And he came out and he spoke to them. He didn't go to speak to every troop, but he went out and spoke to these guys, and they all remember it. It was one of the most memorable events of their life. They all talked about Patton. They also said he was, it's Patton. He's incredible, and he was, and he's also the first to integrate rifle companies. So he's the first to have Black Americans integrated with whites in rifle companies, and he didn't wait for approval. He just did it. So, Patton said some dumb things that, and did some dumb things late in the war, particularly. Some people think that maybe when he was, he was a polo player and he fell off his horse and had some head trauma. So some people think he might have had, head trauma injury like NFL, players have had. And so sometimes he'd say some, kind of crazy stuff, let's face it. But he was still a great general, legendary general. And he should be remembered for, being the first to have black tankers in his Third Army, and for integrating his sharpshooting battalion or sharpshooting companies. So I'll leave it a little bit on the note of Patton.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me about not only your World War II books, but also the William Kidd books that are coming up. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for having me.
Thank you again to Samuel Marquis for joining me for this interview to talk about not only Soldiers of Freedom, but some of the other books in his World War II series and his new book about his ancestor, William Kidd. If you are a fan of historical fiction, if you are a fan of World War II, that time period, you should definitely check this book out. And like I said, it's really good timing that this episode is airing the week of Veterans Day. Speaking of Veterans Day, thank you to everyone who has served in my family, and my grandpa Harry, my uncle Dave, my dad, and my oldest niece have all been in the Navy. In fact, my niece is just finishing up her 4 years in the next week or so, I believe, maybe a couple of weeks. I can't remember the exact date. I'll have to double check on that. But so she has just finished up her time, and her husband actually finished about a month or 6 weeks ago, although he ruined the streak because she married a Marine. but that's okay. We love him anyway. He just ruined my Navy streak. Anyway, thank you to those members of my family, and thank you to everyone who has served. It is so very appreciated. So as always, thank you for joining me, and I hope that you will join me for the next interview that will be with author Solomon Goldstein Rose. He has written a book called The 100% Solution, a plan for solving climate change. So this one is nonfiction, and he talks a lot about what needs to happen in order to ensure that we still have a planet for coming generations. And so it's a bit of a tough read simply because of the overwhelming feel of this problem, but he works very hard throughout the book to create or present solutions that can work. The 100% solution, he says, as opposed to the 10% solution that, kind of just addresses the immediate needs, but not the long-term effects. So hopefully you'll join me for that interview on the next episode. And in the meantime, I hope you are having a wonderful week. If you are a fan of this podcast, please do, as I always ask, write us a nice review. 5 stars are great. Written is great. Everything, is just help us. It helps us to get word about the podcast out there into the world. Thank you for that. And thank you for those of you who follow us on social media. If you do not follow us, I would love to have you follow us. We are Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, GSMC Book Review, pretty easy to find. So thank you so much for following. But if you don't follow us, please do and interact with me. I love to hear your stories. I love to hear what you're reading, just whatever you want to chat about. So thank you so much again for listening, and tune in next time. In the meantime, I hope you're having a wonderful week. Make sure you say thank you to the veterans in your life, and I hope that this week involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.